Currently in the Crucible, Solar 3.0 is everywhere. Between lore leads, classy restoration, and healing grenades, everyone is constantly getting their health back and winning fights they shouldn't. Even I gave into this healing meta with my most recent build video. But like a lot of you, I got tired of dealing with all this healing and sought to create a build designed to combat the healing meta. So today I'll be showing you my Warlock anti-healing build designed to shut down all forms of healing and punish players who try to abuse these healing abilities. So if you're sick of the healing meta or just want to go against the grain, then this video is for you. Today I'm going to cover the subclass, exotics, armor, and weapons you'll want to use to punish anyone using Solar 3.0. Now let's get into the video, and if you find this build helpful, consider dropping a like as it helps support the channel. Diving into our subclass, and it's going to be none other than Shadebinder, and this subclass has a lot of things that literally stops healing in its tracks. Starting with the super, we have Winter's Wrath. I have always been a fan of this super. I think it's one of the best supers in the game still, even with the changes, the multiple changes I should say that it's had throughout its time. This super is incredibly good, especially against things like Golden Gun, especially when you play it near cover. And I like this super because you can kind of like peek shot with it. The tracking is still really good despite all the nerfs. And in my opinion, again, one of the best dueling supers overall, especially if you're utilizing it near cover. And that's really how you want to use this one. Use it near cover, get those freezes off, then use that shatter, especially since that AoE ability goes through walls and goes quite far. So this is definitely not a super you want to like duel out in the open with, especially against Solar 3.0 subclasses like Golden Gun or even people who have throwing hammers. You definitely want to play this where you can bob and weave in and out of cover, especially for supers that are a little bit more mobile. You're going to have to shatter them twice. So that's where you want to play that cover, get the freeze, shatter, pop back out, freeze again, and then shatter again to get those kills on those supers. Obviously against just normal combatants, this thing is absolutely going to just tear. And really with some of the fragments we are using, this super gets even better, but we'll talk about that later. Getting into our abilities, nothing fancy here. We're going to be sticking with Healing Rift. The overall uptime and the overall recovery you get with this is just second to none. Empowering Rift is cool, and there's some cool things you can definitely do with different exotics, but overall, the utility of Healing Rift is just unmatched. For our movement, we are using Burst Glide. This is going to allow us to get around the map as quickly as possible. This is a staple for any of my Warlock builds if you've watched them in the past, but if you haven't, Burst Glide is going to give you the most linear movement across the map without making you floaty, and makes you as or least floaty as possible, if that's even a word, compared to some of these other jumps. For the melee, we have no other choice but Penumbral Blast. This is something where I use it more defensively than I do it offensively. When people are rushing me, or if again I'm caught in a bad spot, I'll just kind of throw this, sometimes even proactively if I'm expecting someone to come around a corner to get some of those freezes off. A lot of times to slow enemies down, but sometimes you do get the kill. From there, for our grenade, we're going to be running the Cold Snap grenade. Now, the Cold Snap grenade does have a slightly higher cooldown, especially compared to something like Dustfield grenades. But with the Cold Snap, you're really going to be able to get a lot of freezes off very quickly and really stop people in their tracks. I'm thinking of specifically for Solar 3.0, Loreley's Titans that are throwing up barriers or shields, and they're sitting in their little flame to get their health back and that health regen. This is perfect for a lot of those stationary targets. Even for Warlocks that are using classy restoration and just sitting in their rift, this Cold Snap grenade really forces your enemy to move. And by doing that, it really gets them off their spot, gets them hopefully out of any ability or exotic that gives them healing in one place. And so this is why we're going to be using Cold Snap along with our exotic, which I'll get into a little bit later. But this is really great for just keeping your enemies moving and just creates just an unknown that they don't know when this Cold Snap could be coming, so they can't just always be super stationary with their pulse rifles or whatever weapons they're using. For our aspects, we are going to be using Frost Pulse. Now, I know a lot of you are probably wondering, what about Bleak Watcher? We are not using Bleak Watcher in this build. This build I primarily mainly used in 6s. If I was using it in 3s though, I might swap out Frost Pulse for Bleak Watcher. But again, this build is going to be all about utilizing your cold snaps as much as possible and freezing as many people using Solar 3.0 as possible to get them off their spot. And so Frost Pulse is just a nice defensive tactic for when people get a little aggressive, especially when they know you're weak and they're taking that damage. If you get really good at timing Frost Pulse well, you get a really nice freeze on your enemies. It can also be used against supers. Again, the timing is everything on this one, so really understanding the timing of your rift is going to allow you to get the most out of this ability. And then from there, we're using Ice Flare Bolt. So shattering a frozen target spawns Seekers that track and freeze other nearby targets. So this is really nice because obviously it works perfectly with Cold Snap grenades. So hopefully as we're running in, killing those frozen targets that we're getting with Cold Snap, that's gonna spawn additional Seekers and really get that chain freezing going where we can get hopefully multiple kills off of one Cold Snap thanks to our Ice Flare Bolts and our ability to kill or shatter a frozen target. This is also great when using in Super with Winter's Wrath. From there, diving into our fragments, and this is where things start getting really exciting. And Whisper of Hedrons is first for our fragments. It dramatically increases weapon stability, weapon aim assist, mobility, resilience, and recovery after freezing a target with stasis. Now, Whisper of Hedrons back in the day used to give you a nice damage boost, and that was back in just the heyday of stasis when it was super OP. And now it's been reworked, and as you can see, it does a lot for boosting your overall stats. And by how much is that? Well, from some research and digging into Reddit and all things like that, I was able to find that you get plus 60 to resilience, mobility, and recovery when using Whisper of Hedrons, and it's all based off of when you freeze a target. And as we talked about with this build, it's gonna be all about getting those freezes with your Cold Snap grenade. So what that's gonna do, it's gonna dramatically increase your stability and weapon aim assist. So with stability and how that's tied into flinch, that means your weapons are gonna be a lot more centered and accurate. Even when you're taking damage, you're not gonna be bouncing all over the place. And with that weapon aim assist, again, just makes your weapon and your ability to hit headshots more generous. And then with mobility and resilience and recovery, that's gonna allow us to move around quicker, take more damage with that higher resilience number, and also, again, resilience and stability tied together to reduce flinch. So further reducing our flinch with that plus 60 resilience. And then recovery, we're already gonna be running max recovery, but it's nice knowing that with Whisper of Hedrons, it does boost that recovery. So that way, if we wanted to maybe divert some stats from recovery to some other things, we could, knowing that we're gonna be getting lots of freezing and activating Whisper of Hedrons, which has about 10-second cooldown that refreshes each time you freeze an opponent. And I'll also mention with Whisper of Hedrons, it does activate in Super when you get those freezes in Super, making you even harder to kill in Super. Allows you to be a little bit more mobile in Shadebinder as well, which can be a little bit slow when just kind of moving around the map, as well as giving you that boost to recovery while in Super. So all these boosts while in Super to make sure that we are just even harder to kill when in Super for Shadebinder. Next, we have Whisper of Torment, which I think really plays off well with Whisper of Hedrons because we're getting that boost to resilience, recovery, mobility. Overall, you can argue that we're going to be a little bit harder to kill, just a little bit. And the fact that with Whisper of Torment, you gain grenade energy each time you take damage from targets feeds perfectly into helping us get our Cold Snap grenades even quicker. Because with this build, you're going to be playing a little bit more aggressively with those Cold Snaps, pushing in on those freezes as you get them, especially when you know a target is stationary, as we mentioned. And that's going to allow you to take a little bit damage as you're trying to close that gap. But also as you're taking that damage and able to take more damage, it's going to help feed into that grenade energy and create a nice synergy with your ability to get Cold Snaps faster. From there, I'm just gonna fast track through these next two fragments because I mainly am using them for the stat boost. Overall, there are some other fragments that are interesting, but overall for the build, I didn't feel made a lot of sense because they required either too perfect of a scenario or situation, or are no longer working as intended. A good example of this is Whisper of Rending. In Whisper of Rending, kinetic weapons do increase damage to stasis crystals and frozen targets. This now for PvP only actually does increase damage to stasis crystals, not frozen targets. So for our build, it doesn't really work well at all. I rather just forfeit that fragment slot and get a plus 10 to resilience and a plus 10 to intellect, specifically for that intellect, so that way I can get my Winter's Wrath super a little bit faster. And then from there, Whisper of Shards, same kind of deal, shattering stasis crystal temporarily boost your grenade recharge rate. This is not going to apply at all in terms of the recharge rate of this fragment, but again, we're just doing it for the plus 10 resilience. So these two are really about getting the stat boost across the board for just to help us divert stats elsewhere or get to a certain stat level that we want. But again, if you all wanted to invest in different fragments here, more power to you. But overall, the most important fragments in this build are going to be Whisper of Hedrons and Whisper of Torment. Starting off with our armor, and I'm going to be starting with our exotic for a couple of reasons. And our exotic is Osmiomancy Gloves. Don't ask me to say that 2 times fast. I'm just going to call them Osmiomancy, or I'm gonna try. In terms of the exotic trait, you have Fervid Cold Snap. Your Cold Snap grenades have an additional charge that recharges quicker on direct impact. The Seeker spawn from Cold Snap grenades travel further. So overall, with this exotic, what it does, it's gonna give you that additional charge with our Cold Snap, allowing us to trigger Whisper of Hedrons more frequently. Of course, hopefully getting more freezes with that extra grenade charge, but also makes the Cold Snap more effective overall, since it now travels faster and thus makes it a little bit more consistent. Now getting into the other pieces of this armor, and that's another piece, is overload rounds. Uninterrupted fire from your equipped auto rifles and submachine guns grants bullets that stun combatants, delaying ability energy regeneration and lowering combatant damage output. And so what this does in PvP is it delays the health regen of Solar 3.0. It doesn't stop those large chunks of health that people can get, but specifically the health regen. When you hit an enemy with these overload rounds, it's going to stop that health regen. And so this is something that really, when paired with Osmiomancy Gloves, it really helps this build come to life, because we're now not only going to be freezing enemies that are utilizing these healing abilities in place, but now using these overload rounds, we're going to be stopping their health regen. And this can really throw off your enemies, because they get so used to having that health regen and then coming back to re-engage. But you'll find when they come to re-engage you, their health is a little bit lower because they didn't get that regen that they thought they were. And so that's why I really highly recommend running overload rounds on this build with Osmiomancy Gloves, because these two pieces right here, this mod, this exotic, really help this build come to life. And with that Cold Snap, it just Fervid Cold Snap exotic trait, it just makes Cold Snap so much more consistent. Without this exotic, I really am not a fan of Cold Snaps in just their normal form, but again, with this exotic, they become much more effective, and you get that additional charge, which is great. As far as the rest of our armor, starting with our helmet, I'm actually running double shotgun targeting. As you can see over here, I'm running that because of my heritage shotgun, and this is, I found, is super effective when you're freezing targets, because now you have a stationary target and it's easy to get those slug precision kills, and this still does enough damage to one-shot headshot even when they're frozen. And that's why I run the double targeting, just to make this even more generous, and I throw on the targeting adjuster just to make it just obscene in terms of how generous the hitbox is for headshots on this thing. And then from there, going back and just tying it into the gloves, we have our funnel web. I highly recommend for PvP a funnel web with as much range as possible, and rangefinder. The other perks, in terms of your third slot here, and I'm sure there's some good options. I find subsistence is fine, it's definitely not ideal, but most important thing is you want to get as much range as possible, and it really makes funnel web just a menace in the crucible. The only other thing I might recommend instead of funnel web would be Teraba. I don't have one, I'm working on it, I don't want to talk about it. Moving on to our chest piece, I am further just tying in and building into that unflinching with Whisper of Hedrons and all those boosts stat boosts we'll be getting from that, and using double unflinching submachine gun aim. And when you trigger Whisper of Hedrons with this, on top of the fact that we already have a base 6 resilience, this thing literally does not move. Not that it moved a lot to begin with, but literally you're taking fire and it's still just shooting straight as an arrow on the enemy's head. And so that's why I recommend running double unflinching submachine gun aim here. From there, for our boots, I'm running submachine gun holster and shotgun holster, which is artifact mod. This just allows us to get that quick swap between the two weapons, since I'm not using Ophidians here. I don't want to talk about that either. And then for our class ability, and this is huge here, quick charge. You want to make sure you're using quick charge here, because it's going to greatly increase the ready speed of fusion rifles, shotguns, submachine guns, and swords. So literally the two weapons we are using, mainly a shotgun and a machine gun, it's going to greatly increase the ready speed of both of these weapons, which is super nice, especially since the funnel web handling is, I mean, it's already pretty good compared with heritage. So both these have already high handling already, and having quick charge is going to make it feel that much better. And then from there, Gallahorn as our exotic, but again, this may not be the most effective choice anymore, so it might be a better option to go with another heavy that is your favorite. But ultimately, heavy, as for most of my builds, is not like really a feature. Mainly it's going to be these weapons and how they tie in with our exotic. And for our stats, I'm just gonna really talk about what's the most important stats you should be investing in. And the two are still gonna be recovery. You wanna get this as close to tier 10 or 100 recovery as possible. And then for discipline, if you can get this to 100 without annihilating the rest of your stats, I highly recommend doing so. I was lucky enough to get to tier 8 or at 80 discipline without completely wrecking the rest of my stats. But overall, I would say if I get this to 100 and get similar stats, I would definitely do that, especially knowing if we're going to be getting a large stat boost from Whisper Hedrons rather frequently. And then from there, after recovery, discipline, I would try to go either intellect or resilience. But again, if I had to choose which to invest in, I'd probably go intellect. Again, knowing with Whisper Hedrons, I'm going to be frequently getting that plus 60 to resilience. Outside of that, for mobility and strength, you can kind of do what you feel is best. Again, I think the closer you can get to like the 1 minute mark on strength, the better. I was not really able to get close to that, unfortunately, but again, normal blast, not really a feature, and it can be really hard to land anyways, so I'm not going to overinvest in strength just to compensate. And again, mobility, I don't find this stat super valuable, but even then, I'm still getting a huge boost, as we've mentioned, from Whisper of Hedrons here. Most important thing though, just to recap, recovery and discipline, try to get these both as close to 100 as possible, and then start going into intellect after that. Overall, there was no describing the joy I got from using this build to combat Solar 3.0 in the Crucible, and I think once you freeze your first low release Titan, you'll see what I'm talking about. If you enjoyed this video, check out my latest pulse rifle video at the top, or if you're curious about my healing build for Warlock, check out the video at the bottom.